Welcome to another episode of Food, Nutrition, and Wellness with Dr. Dan Remley. Today, he's going to be looking at the workers that work in food pantries. So stay tuned. Welcome back to another episode of Food, Nutrition, and Wellness with Dr. Dan Remley. Dan Remley is a field specialist with the Ohio State University Food, Nutrition, and Wellness program. Dan, it's always a pleasure talking with you. You have really good insights on how we can stay healthy, wealthy, and wise.
Glad to be here. Thanks for asking me. Come on.
And it's my understanding that in today's episode, we're going to be talking about workers who work in food pantries.
Well, more specifically, we're going to talk about a model that food pantries can use so that they can offer healthier choices for people. And we're also going to talk about how staff and volunteers that work at a food pantry can encourage people to make healthy choices. Most operations rely on volunteers. Many do have like a paid staff position, like a director, but it just depends on where they're at. Pantries have been around mostly since World War II. And a traditional pantry really, it's kind of like you walk into the pantry if you have a need and you're given a box or a bag of food. And you may know how to use that food or like that food, but you get what you get. You don't have a fit, right? So our model is changing because we want to prevent food waste, because if you get a box or bag of food that you don't really need or want, or your family doesn't like, what do you do with it? Our new models are client choice. And so users can come into the food pantry and choose their food. And so it's set up like a grocery store. And so you're not getting a box or a bag of food that's been pre-selected. You actually get to choose food that you need or you want. And this is important because some people have food allergies. Some people have dietary restrictions. So it's more client-centered, client-focused.
Well, the food pantry I was thinking about, I think it was a food buyers club. Maybe that's what it was, where you put X amount of dollars in and then you received whatever kind of cheeses or produce products, etc. Is that still considered a food pantry?
That sounds a little bit like a CSA or a community supported agriculture type of operation. But most food pantries, there isn't any contribution that people have to make. They just have to qualify. Sometimes it depends on the policies of the food pantry. Program that I'd like to talk to you about is called the Voices for Food program. And this was developed by 6 states. We had a research and extension grant. And we came together and we developed a toolkit. And so if you work at a food pantry or you're a director, you can use this toolkit to develop this type of model for your food pantry. So we have 2 purposes for the toolkit. There's we want to help food pantries move to the My Choice guided client choice pantry model. And also we want to help food pantry volunteers and staff learn how to promote nutrition and promote healthy choices within their food pantry. So we're changing the environment of the food pantry so that people can choose food and they learn about healthy choices, but also as volunteers within the pantry, as they walk through the pantry with people, with the pantry clients, they can promote nutrition and health and healthy choices. So these are the goals of the client choice, the My Choice model. We want to promote health and food security of the people that use the pantries and allowing them to choose food from each of the food groups available within the pantry. We also want to increase the interaction between food pantry volunteers, staff, and clients, as well as fostering health relationships. So we want the food pantry volunteers and the clients that are using the food pantry to engage with each other. And so this is really helpful because the food pantries learn about the preferences and needs of people that are using the food pantry. And then we also recommend practices for food pantries transitioning to the My Choice model. And the My Choice, we have a frequently asked questions document in this toolkit. So it just helps pantry volunteers and staff learn how to transition to the model. So a My Choice food pantry is set up like a grocery store. And so this is different than a food pantry, maybe, you talked about in the 70s or the 60s, because with those food pantries, there was, you were just handed a box or bag and you didn't necessarily know, how you were going to use the items that you were given, or you didn't like them. And so what happens? Those foods were wasted or left at the curb. Some people would trade them. So the client choice model really started to gain traction like in the 80s and 90s. And I would say most pantries offer some element of choice, but they address food waste because people are choosing food that they need or prefer. They're not wasting food at home, if that makes sense. And so this particular model of choice pantries uses the food groups. And so I know I've talked to you about the My Plate model, Patrick. This is based on the dietary guidelines. And so there's different food groups, right? So it recommends that our plate should consist of as many food groups as possible. There's 5 major food groups. And so most of our plate should be made up of fruits and vegetables. A portion of our plate could consist of grains like cereals and pasta. And then we've got protein, there's meat and vegetable protein, and then there's dairy. And food groups are important to consider because foods within those food groups all have similar nutrients. So, for example, foods in the vegetable group have a lot of fiber. They often have vitamins like vitamin A and vitamin C. And commonly, they don't have, with the exception of starchy vegetables, they don't have a lot of carbohydrate. Fruit, pretty much the same thing, except they're a little bit higher. They have higher natural sugar, but they also have higher fiber, lots of vitamins, and so forth. All the foods in the dairy group, they have calcium. So the more food groups that are represented on your plate, the more nutritious your meal is. In addition, we have in the My Choice food pantry model, we have 2 additional groups. We have the miscellaneous and combination. Because, really, not every food item fits neatly into those food groups. And so, if you think about cooking ingredients like flour and sugar and syrup and things like that, it's hard to place those in those major food groups. And what's more, a lot of the foods that come to a food pantry are highly processed. So they have lots of added sugar and salt and sodium. So think about potato chips. Potato chips technically could be a vegetable, right? But they're so highly processed, and they have, it's a potato. You cut the potato, but you soak them and, you fry them, and then you put a lot of salt on them. So they're not as healthy as a standard vegetable. And so we put the unhealthier choices in these 2 food groups. And so we have the miscellaneous, and that includes like cooking ingredients, but also your cookies, your cakes, your chips, and your candies. And so those foods that are highly processed. And then we have a combination, and this is a brown food group. And so these are like your soups and your stews and your meals and boxes. All of these combination foods have more than one food group, but they typically are highly processed. So they have lots of added sugar and fat and salt too. So basically, when people come through the food pantry, they get so many choices within each food group. So they get so many fruit choices, they get so many vegetable choices, they get so many protein choices. And it's all organized according to those color-coded food groups. And people get so many choices based on their family size, if that makes sense. So as people are moving through the pantry and choosing food off the shelf, there's a volunteer, like a shopping assistant, that helps them navigate through the food pantry and learn about, how many choices they might get per food group. And so this is an opportunity. It's an opportunity for the staff and volunteers to interact and engage with people that are coming into the pantry, but they can also promote nutrition and health and food safety.
Let's suppose that I come in and all I want is grains. I want rice. I want wheat. I don't want anything else. Is that permissible?
It just depends. Some food pantries are pretty flexible. So if you just want grains and you don't want, you say you just want cereal, you want pasta, you want, rice, but you don't want, you don't want any of the food groups, and that's certainly your prerogative. You don't have to pick any other, from any other food groups. Now, some pantries will allow you to get more choices, from if you just want grains, you get more choices if you don't want any other foods from those food groups. Does that make sense? From those other food
Yes.
groups?
So in other words, I'm allowed, when you say choices, I'm allowed up to 5 or 10 items. Is that correct?
It depends on your family size. And so bigger families get more choices.
Okay.
And so if you're a smaller family, it's just you and your wife, you're going to get less choices than a larger family. So if you're a family a size of 2, you might only get 2 choices in the grains group. As opposed to a family size of 5, they might get 5 choices.
Oh, okay.
But what I'm saying is that, if you're not choosing any other choice, you're not choosing from any other food group, they might allow more choices from the grains. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
But it just depends on the food pantry. And sometimes they'll put restrictions on certain foods just to make sure that they don't have a run. They don't run out of certain foods for people at the end of the line. So what we can do is train volunteers and staff to promote nutrition within the food pantries. And we can give them a crash course on nutrition, food safety, but also we give them some soft skills. What's the best way to engage with people that are coming through the food pantry, and often so we promote cultural competency to help them interact more effectively with people from different social, economic, cultural backgrounds than themselves. But we also give them some techniques, some communication strategies called change talk. I'll talk a little bit more about what that is. So we train them about nutrition, food safety, but then we give them those skills to promote nutrition and food safety within the pantry. But once trained, these people that come through our training, they're called Voices for Food Ambassadors. They can become champions for nutrition within their home food pantries, of course, but also the larger community. So just a review, we organize the food pantry by the color-coded food groups, and we place posters on shelves to indicate the food group and the number of items each family size may take from each food group. And the categories and colors follow the My Plate model. And so, for example, you see that the vegetables are green. And so you might have shelves, you might have a three-level shelf. Each level is going to be coded green, and all those shelves will carry vegetables. And then you can go to the fruit section, it'll be the same type of thing. And so each pantry decides how many items clients will be allowed to choose from each group. And your current inventory and client family size often influence. So some pantries don't have a lot of inventory, and so they have to be careful about how many choices they allow. But typically, like I said earlier, larger families will get more choices per food group. So, for example, Mid-Ohio Collective serves several counties in central Ohio, and they receive like the commodities from the government, but also they receive foods from things like Walmart and Kroger, and donations, and then they distribute those foods to the affiliated food pantries.
Are you seeing companies like Kroger's or Walmart or places that handle a lot of food, that when the expiration date gets real close to that date, that they will give it to the food pantry?
Yes, they are. In fact, the labels, use by dates, those types of labels, they don't indicate, whether or not the food is safe to eat or not. Those are use by, sell by dates are indications of quality. They don't signify whether or not the food is safe to eat or not.
And do you find that many of the volunteers have a beginning background in food nutrition, or is that where the training comes in?
That's a good question. Yeah, some do. Some have been. We've worked with the retired teachers that taught home economics, for example. Um, but a lot of times people don't have, or they have their own opinions about nutrition too, which is not always good. So we try to give them, what's the evidence base, and our training is based on the dietary guidelines, and so it's evidence based.
Do you go to the different food pantries, or is it sort of a group
Yes,
setting?
yeah, we typically it's usually about a half a day long or 6 hours, and we show up and work in the group settings.
And when you do go to the pantries, I'm assuming that most of the volunteers are willing to follow your guidelines.
Yeah, we don't police them, so but some of the food pantry directors are want the staff and volunteers to promote nutrition, and so they may follow up with people and see how they're doing. But yeah, our job is just to equip the volunteers and staff with the tools that they need to promote nutrition within the food pantry. And I will say too, typically a food pantry will reorganize and reorganize to the My Choice model, and so they'll get all their signage up, and then we'll come in and do the training. So this is also helpful, but because people, when they reorganize to My Choice, they need to know, which foods belong in which food groups. So, for example, eggs are a protein; they don't belong in the dairy. But a lot of times they think, well, dairy, eggs do belong in dairy because that's where you find them typically in the supermarkets, right?
Yeah, I would have thought that they were dairy, but I guess I'm wrong.
Yes. So you would learn that they're actually protein. So yeah, after the pantry's been reorganized and color coded, and they decide on how many choices people get, and then we come in with the training. What we want at the end of the training, we want volunteers to be able to effectively promote nutrition and food safety within the pantries when they're talking to people that are coming through, and not only the pantry, but just be proactive about their families or communities' food needs, preferences, concerns. And then to be able to engage with, we try to have like a food council that addresses food issues within the community as well. So we want the food pantries and the clients and volunteers and staff to engage with those food councils. And those food councils really try to connect the food pantries with other food pantries so they can share facilities and resources. So, for example, one food pantry might have too many tomatoes. And so they might send out an email and say, hey, do you need an email to the other food pantries and say, hey, I've got excess tomatoes. Do you need tomatoes? So it's a way for them to partner with other organizations to improve their operations, if that makes sense. And so these are the components of the Voices for Food Ambassador training. There's nutrition, there's food safety, there's cultural competency, and then there's change talk. We asked them, what are their experiences encouraging someone to eat healthier? So you see this diagram here. This is what the tip plate looks like versus what it should look like. Generations today, I think that people eat out a lot more. And back when we were growing up, we just didn't eat out very often. There weren't many restaurants even.
Right. Yes, that is true.
So, I mean, I drive this my high school, and I didn't see any. I wouldn't drive by any fast food places. But now I drive my kids to school, and when I drove my kids, we'd go by at least half a dozen.
Yes,
so our environment's changed a lot, and that's influenced how we eat. But the fact that you probably grew up having family meals, that's even no matter what you ate, I think family meals is research shows there's a lot of positive outcomes that can result from just eating together.
Yes.
In terms of communication and helping kids, and helping with stress and helping with just that communication component is really important. So we asked them these questions about their attitudes, because there's this common attitude that we find in our research that volunteers and also clients have this attitude that beggars can't be choosers. And so we really want to confront that attitude head on when we do these trainings. So what that means is that if the volunteer has that attitude, they get upset if somebody asks for something. They think, well, they're a beggar, they can't be a chooser, so they get what they get, they don't have a fit. So these volunteers that have this attitude think that the clients really don't. They shouldn't be proactive. They should just settle on what they get, and they shouldn't. They get when they get, and they shouldn't have a fit. And if they, how dare they ask for something in the pantry? So we want to confront that, but we also want the clients to. We also want to address that attitude with clients too. We know from research as well that somebody who walks into a food pantry and lives with diabetes, they're actually less likely to speak out or be proactive about their needs in terms of their health. And so we want the volunteers to engage with people through conversation and find out, hey, you have diabetes. Let me help you make some healthy choices to help you manage your disease. So we ask them about these statements, and we ask, do you think that food pantries, should we be engaging with clients about their needs and preferences? Is promoting health as important as giving away food? So people that use a food pantry should be able to choose what they want and what they need. What do you think about that? We talk about, the nutrition labels and how do you help somebody read a food label and make healthier choices? We often do food safety training, though sometimes the food banks will do this training. So we won't do this. But this gets into, how do you deal with at-risk audiences? How do you store food? How do you package? What about food dating, pest management, keeping food that's in the correct temperature that needs to be refrigerated, those types of things. And then cultural competency is really all about, how do you interact with people that are different than you? Maybe they're younger people, or they're older, or maybe they're different religion or ethnicity. Maybe they're have come from a different social, economic background. And this is important because how you think about somebody really influences how you communicate. And maybe you've walked into a meeting, Patrick, or a room where you kind of feel like people aren't looking at you funny.
Yeah.
So it's not really what you say. It's kind of how you think about a person, or like their you look at their visible characteristics and you start to make assumptions about that person.
Yeah.
And 60% of how we communicate is nonverbal.
Yes.
So your perception of somebody really does influence how you communicate, even though it's really not what you say to somebody, but it's just kind of your body language and all that. So we do this one activity called the tip of the iceberg, where we give people, we talk about, the fact that really 75% of what makes up a person occurs underneath the surface. So these are characteristics about somebody that's hidden. And what you see at the surface, the 25%, these are visible characteristics. So, for example, you might not know that I have type 1 diabetes just by looking at me. But if you talk to me, I might share that I have diabetes. And kind of the idea behind this lesson is don't judge the book by its cover. So just because somebody walks in and they've got, maybe they have a mohawk, or maybe they dress differently than you, don't assume things. Really, what you have to do is talk to people and find out what's going on in their life, and really challenge your assumptions about somebody. Because again, it gets back to the thinking that how you think about somebody really influences how you communicate. And if we're going to promote nutrition and health, and we want these volunteers to promote the food groups and nutrition messages, they need to be able to relate to people and connect with people, and be able to relate messages to the person's life. And perspective changes everything. So people are like icebergs, and we project feelings, and we can make up somebody's story, but it can lead to assumptions, right? Here's sort of an example of this. These are scientists, I think, and they're observing an elephant, but they're all blindfolded, right? So they all have different perceptions of what they're looking at, or feeling, or touching. And we also look at privilege too. And so privileges are important. We all have privileges are things that we inherit or we grow up with. And we're not always aware that we have privileges. And for example, I had a car growing up, right? My parents had a car, but not everybody had a car growing up. Or with some people, based on if you have you might have a different experience in a grocery store. If you, for example, you're an African American, you might feel like you were followed by somebody like a security person, and so just your ethnicity actually can be a privilege in some cases. And then we also have a generational activity where you learn about different generations and there's different generations. There's a silent generation that would be my parents that are born a little bit before World War II. And then there's the baby boomers. They were born after World War II. And Generation X, that's my generation. They were born late 60s to 1980. And then there's the millennials who were born after 1980. And then there's other generations too. But your generation really does, they explore like life events, values, work ethic, communication style, technology, and then points of view about various things. And typically, like you have, depending on your generation, you have similar life events, right? So if you're in the silent generation, what's the kind of the defining point? The defining experience of the silent generation would be probably World War II and maybe possibly the Great Depression. The baby boomers, they lived through Kennedy getting shot, for example. But each generation has a different way of seeing the world and doing things, and so that's what we do is we try to get the different generations together to explore these things. And this is important because in a food pantry too, a lot of times the volunteers, the staff might be older than the clients coming in, so it's important to understand maybe how different generations might communicate. And then finally, another skill that we promote is change talk. And this is a strategy where we try to encourage volunteers and staff to ask open-ended questions. And this is a way to engage and learn about what's going on in somebody's life, what their needs and preferences might be, but it's through dialogue. It's important in nutrition education because if I say to you, hey, did you know, half your plate should be fruits and vegetables, that comes across as kind of judgy or judgmental. And so we want more of an engagement. So what types of vegetables do your kids like? How do you like to prepare your vegetables? So you ask those questions with like how or what or why. You lead those questions with and that elicits a response. A closed-ended question would start out like, do you, it's like a yes or no response. So we want those open-ended questions.